Our discussion today is around contract negotiation, subcontracting, and sub-award management. And I hope I'm audible enough to everyone. If I'm not, please let me know. So contract negotiation takes on the basic skills that we learn from childhood, right from the time you were born, starting to negotiate when you hit the world and you cried, and you negotiated with your mother to give you your breast. So those skills, sometimes we say are God-given, and other times we can acquire skills as we go along life. We gain more skills. So these skills do not stop at that point. We grow these skills into several negotiations like we are going to see. So our take home this time, we hope that by the time we end this session, we shall know more about negotiation skills that we need to apply when we are in contracting phrases. We want to know how to win, and both parties will be happy about that, and areas to negotiate. There are areas that you think, yes, this is negotiable, and areas you say, let me just compromise. Let's just agree to have it as is. That is also part of negotiation. We look more into details of subcontracting, the processes, what we need to be aware of, what we need to focus on, and then the documents in subcontracting, sub-award management. This is really a very wide topic, and I am hopeful that the summaries that we are going to look out for, the summaries that we are going to look at are just a drop in the ocean, and they are just opening our understanding to several areas that we are actually working with, and then things that we can acquire from elsewhere. And we are going to look at more into managing sub-grantees or sub-recipients from the start of the project, from the time we sign the sub-award agreement to the time we say it is all said and done, we've received our aims and objectives, and we're now closing out. So this is basically what we're going to be looking at in the next 1 and so hours. And yes, okay. So the next slide is about negotiation, basic areas of negotiation in our day-to-day life. It's not only in winning grants, but also our daily lives, like mortgages. We've all negotiated our contracts, our employment contracts. We've negotiated loans and mortgages. We've negotiated procurement deals. And also maybe in marriages, there are those takes and gives. So these are just basic skills that we use, that we grow into contract negotiations. So there definitely has to be discussions in contracts and agreements. At a certain time, you say, yes, we are compromising, but you need to have the skill, the inborn skill that is grown, and the skills that are acquired as we go along the way. So award negotiation in contracts is that process, and there are those activities which we engage in between proposal submission and that point when they say, yes, you have won the award, and the actual signing or accepting the award, as we are going to see in detail. This can be on the side of the main grantee, which is the prime, getting the grant from the sponsor, or the sub-grantee getting the grant from the prime awardee. So we are going to see an approach which is basically called principled negotiation. And principled negotiation looks at the outcome where everyone comes out of the negotiations happy. It is not one-sided. It is not the winner takes it all issue. So principled negotiation looks at interests for both parties. It is not self-centered, it's not selfish, it is not based in one position. So the interest should be looked at from both angles, from both sides. So it is not position-based, but it is looking at the interests for both sides. So the interests include concerns that if certain issues are not fulfilled, you are able to convince the sponsor or the prime awardee that if we do not fulfill these issues, there could be a delay in attaining our objectives, or the grant may not actually be implemented at all, or there could be some instances where we cannot actually meet our objectives. So the negotiator has to be in a position of convincing positively, objectively, the other party, the sponsor or the prime awardee. And you need to show that if you don't do this, then we are not there. So the interests are desires, the fears that are important to both sides. So we also want to look at 4 main tenets of principled negotiation. So even in our normal lives, when you want to win, there are 4 main tenets of principled negotiation. So you need to really look at a good communicator on the team. Okay, you're winning a grant, you're winning a grant, yes, you're at that point, but in the team, when you're selecting a team, get someone who can communicate clearly so that the negotiation is not clouded, it is not detracted from the substantive issues. So separate people from the problem, the emotions and the people, like faulty perceptions and poor communications, the allegations, I had COVID, did this and that, but if it is not really coming out of facts and it's just emotions, those things should be left out. So there has to be a separation of people from the problem. The second one is focusing on the interests of the substantive issues. So negotiation should be about getting what you really need, not setting out arbitrary positions and defending it at all costs. For example, if you want to really remunerate our staff very well, and you say we can retain them because, for example, some of the grants, some of the projects happen in very rural areas, and it's very hard to attract the quality staff to work into those rural areas. So in your project proposal, you could have hiked probably 10% more than the market rate. And then your fringe benefits could be probably a little way out of the range. You need to negotiate, you have to focus on the interests. It's not really merely getting more money for your staff, but you need to convince the sponsor that if we remunerate our staff very well, we can attract them to work in those rural areas and also retain them up to the time we have this project end. We are not going to be involved in a high staff turnover, which advertently definitely affects the progress of the project. So the third one is expand the pie. Expand the pie. Look for a way to provide mutual gain. Expand the discussion to include other elements so that both parties can feel they came out of the negotiation in a win-win, someone who can convince them. So the project can actually end. You can say that if we use this quality of staff, we can actually end the project, finish the project, get the objectives earlier than the proposed work plan, earlier than the proposed timelines, so that the other party on the other side of the negotiation table we also get that interest, okay? You're not really looking at your side alone, but if also the project is getting objectives earlier, meaning there could be savings in time and effort and funding. Okay, so insist on objectivity. Look outside for references on what is fair. For example, can say if for sister organizations, they are paying not only the statutory obligations under fringe, but they have severance pay. They have a third, what do you call it? They have a 13th month, and you can ably support and convince the sponsor to insist on objectivity by comparing what other areas outside what you're really discussing, like comparing the sister organizations, their pay scales, their range of benefits, so that you can really convince the other party that yes, we can do it, as long as that is allowable, and as long as all what you're trying to put forth is supported, for example, by your institutional policies. You're not really coming out of the blue, but you're being objective. So those areas apply both in our normal life and also in the lives of contract negotiation. So we also want to look at, what next? We have received the award. We have the notification. The document is there, yes, but we haven't signed the document. We are still in negotiation. So what next when we receive the notification? So everyone is happy. The team that was on the grant writing table, they are all happy. The sleepless nights have paid off. So what happens? So study the award documents so that as the PI, the administrative team that are going to be involved in the post-award activities, sit and study the documents. We just don't plunge into implementation. As you study the documents, pick out the terms and conditions that need to be negotiated before the institution accepts the award. It could be probably too late if we don't do that. So we do that by applying the skills that we have just talked about in contract negotiation. Set up meetings to discuss. You have already read through the notification. You have noted some of the contentious issues that could probably deter or affect the implementation of the project. Set up a meeting to discuss these areas and include the people that matter. So effectively negotiating a contract is essential to successful implementation of a project. So get the people who are knowledgeable in that area. If it is about fringe, get someone who is knowledgeable on the team. If it is about some legal requirement, get a legal officer who is knowledgeable in that area. If it's about the certifications, get someone who is able to justify and to provide more information so that when you go at the negotiation table, you have all the information and you're coming from an informed point of view. So negotiation largely depends on the following. So the terms sometimes may not be fixed by the sponsor, e.g. cost of reimbursable expenditure funding mechanism. So negotiation largely depends on the sponsor. What are the terms of the sponsor? Some sponsors are flexible. For example, under fringe, I have had, this is not really basically NIH, but there is a sponsor where the initial fringe was budgeted at 8%, and we happened to negotiate to have it increased to 15%. But this, as I said, was not really NIH. Funding mechanism. So under funding mechanism, in the award documents, there could have been a specific way of how the sponsor or the prime is going to be funding the recipient. And some of the ways could be cost reimbursable, meaning they are not advancing you funds for the initial start of the project, but they expect you to start the project implementation, and after 3 months, you provide the invoice. That is cost reimbursable. They are reimbursing the costs that you have incurred, vis-a-vis giving you advances, probably on milestone. So you can negotiate saying, no, we don't have the funds for fronting the expenditure. Please, let's have a 10%, a 20% that can be advanced against the initial startup of the project, and then we shall provide accountability, and it's going to be on a milestone reimbursement and rolled over throughout the project life. So those are the areas to look out for when you get notification of the grant receipt, and then you look out for these terms and sit down, discuss with your teams, see what is applicable, see what is going to hamper the progress of the project, and then see how to deal with that. At this time, have not yet signed the acceptance, the start of the project. Yes, we're still at what next. So after studying the grant, looking out for the contentious issues that may affect compliance, they could be asking too much, and this probably may affect the compliance. We had a grant we are working with, for example, where there was a term of professional indemnity in one of the clauses. So as an organization, we needed to have the professional indemnity insurance, and by that time, there was no insurance organization in Uganda offering professional indemnity. And to make matters worse, that was going to come off our budget. And for us to have that effected, we could have to get probably an insurance company from the US, and that would be increasing the cost of operations, and it would hamper the cost, it would hike the cost of having this project implemented very well. So we had to fight it back. It delayed the start of the project for at least 1 month, because they also we needed to give them time to consult with the NIH and all that. And finally, that was acceptable. So both sides, one, we were happy that we did not have to go into the cumbersome ways of getting these insurance companies from the US because of the clause of professional indemnity. So differentiate common legal elements, budgeting, and key contract elements. So be keen on what has been accepted as the budget. There could be areas at the proposal that were put into the proposal budget, and later on, when the award is given, maybe 6 months down the road, things have changed. These are areas that you could go back at the table and negotiate. There are key contract elements. Key contract elements would be the scope. Are you able to deliver the objectives with the amount of money that has been given with the award? Or do you need to change some of the areas? There are strategies that have ended, that have changed, that you need to cost. Do you need to recost your work plan? So these are all the areas that you want to look at. Then common legal elements. So there are those certifications, like certifications that are put in the notice of award. And this certification definitely go into the sub-award agreement. So you need to, and this, you don't have much to do about them. Things like certifications of lobbying, debarment. So those you can leave them at that. Okay, so as you look at the documents, please define the purpose of the clauses. Indemnification, public rights, intellectual property. What does the clause say about intellectual property? What do we need to document at the close of the project? What do we need to file as intellectual property? So as you go through all these, documenting them, don't leave them at the time, at the point you had the discussions. Please document. These things will be very important at the time of the negotiation and the time that you're closing out the project. So see how some clauses can adversely affect the project or institution, like I've explained, and then policies and procedures related to administering the grant, like your fringe. Yes, these are all the things that you're going to look at before you actually sign the award document. So some common negotiable areas, there are many, by the way.
Rebecca?
So yes, please.
Sorry to interrupt you a bit. There is just a simple observation from your first slide that you mentioned principled negotiation. So there is an inquiry that are there any other types of contract negotiation apart from principled negotiation?
Just like I said in the beginning, so there are several negotiation areas that you could probably come up with. They're not really principled. Principled means you have principles you are looking at that can drive you to this. This is like a systematic way of negotiation. So other areas could be arbitrary. So as I said in the beginning, that under principled negotiation, you have knowledge, you have skill, you have knowledge of the things that you're talking about, you have skill and you have experience and you are flexible. Other than that, other things that are not principled, you can just come out of the blue. You haven't even prepared for this meeting and you say, this is what I had, unprincipled, what I can say, unprincipled. Just get the call, just organize, oh, we need a Zoom meeting to discuss about this. I've had this also before, where actually this was a sub-grant. You said, I think we need to talk about this. Do you have time in the afternoon? And I say, yes. That wasn't principled. And by the time we left that meeting, everyone was confused. And I would say that wasn't principled. It was not on principle. So if there are other mentioned, I could provide them later. But what I can say about this one is a straight, organized way of negotiation. I'm not sure whether I've answered that.
Yes, Rebecca, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So some of the common negotiable areas in grants, some things that have come up right from experience and also from consultation. This is what happens. Many people, when they look at the budget later on, they discover that the effort that we put in the proposal could probably not support the kind of work, the clinical trial that we are going to have. So as we say here, effort may not match the budgeted effort that is allocated at the proposal writing may not match actual effort needed for the key personnel to execute the grant, and vice versa. So NIH or the sponsor or the prime may request you to adjust the effort. But one thing that you need to know as a sub-grantee or as a prime, no effort if you do an effort mapping, because this is also another area. Effort mapping for all the people on this project, especially the key personnel. You should never have effort that is more than 100% for one person. So as you do your effort mapping, effort planning, always have a schedule of effort versus actual, planned effort versus actual for every key personnel, because NIH is able to see this in the grant platforms for the key personnel where someone has planned beyond 100%. And definitely NIH is going to get back to you to say, please, can you justify the effort of this PI? Can you justify the effort of this key personnel? And that can be something serious. So we have had issues about the fringe. Any fringe that you have to put in the proposal must be supported by your institutional policies, by your signed institutional policies. And you should not change the institutional policies because you have received a big grant. For example, you've had your statutory fringe of NSSF and workman's compensation and probably medical. Yeah, those are the three types of fringe, and you have your institutional policies that have been working over 30 years. But when you win this big grant, you say it's time for us to celebrate and change the fringe. Now you include severance pay, retirement benefit, 13th month. And at the point when you are writing the proposal, what you submitted had a different fringe rate. So these must be supported and you have to be consistent. These are the fringe benefits that have been running unless that was adjusted prior. So that can be acceptable. But when it is done much later and it wasn't even in the proposed budget, at the point of actual expenditure, the auditor sees expenditure that is way above what was budgeted. Probably the project started late. In terms of expenditure rate, burn rate, you're not doing bad from the start of the project. But when they see the details of the actual expenditure, your expenditure has items that were not mentioned at the time of the budgeting. So that can be an issue, it can be contentious. So I think I've gone a little more ahead into the sub-award management, but that is okay, it's still knowledge. So the payment terms, work plan modifications, these are the things that we see in negotiations. For example, cost reimbursable versus a milestone approach. Under the milestone approach, they initially advance the institution money to start off the project. Maybe they start with a 20%, and then if you have a milestone, the second milestone will be a 30% and another 30 and a 20%. So we had some challenge with one of the grants where it was a big grant and we were requested to use the cost reimbursable kind of payment. This was a challenge because you are not supposed to commingle funds, and the institution that I was supporting then did not have any foundational funding, meaning there is no way you could start up activities without any advanced money. And they were really strict about commingling funds. And the terms were cost reimbursable. For example, you pay, the grant is starting January 2021, you have spent salaries, you have spent on your IRB approvals, UNSST approvals, and you need to pay all this. So it was very hard. and you had to go to the table, to the negotiation table, to say, guys, you cannot start. Yes, the project is good, it has been selected, but you cannot start. We need to revise the payment terms. So this eventually worked out perfect, and we had the terms changed. And the work plan was not affected because we had money to implement. And yes, it was successfully completed. So there are policies, as I have said before, I have already explained the policies of indemnity, and there are several other areas which are negotiable in grants. But what you can insist on is in grants negotiation, please, yes, you have won the grant, you have received the notification, don't hurry to sign. Sit down, study the grant, and do not you should not really overlook the terms that are always put in small letters. They could affect the grant and say, oh, you signed this, and insurance companies are very good at that. So winning a negotiation, this is our next slide. So in winning a negotiation, a grant negotiation, as I said, you need to have knowledge. On your team, get someone who has proper knowledge, proper information about what you're going to present at the table, who has experience. So if it is about effort reporting, if it's about sub-granting, are we taking on this sub-grantee? Why are we taking on this sub-grantee? As long as the sub-grantee is not debarred from active implementation of work, actual costs that it takes, fringe rates, indirect costs, get someone on the team that is knowledgeable. Get someone who can talk. Some people are very good at implementation, but they cannot talk. They cannot discuss issues. They cannot put forward issues, and vice versa. Others are well endowed in discussion and negotiations. Those are tasks. They are tactics that they use. They are skilled in negotiating, in talking to other people, in delivering, in convincing. Others do not have that gifting. So you need someone in the team like that. So, and then be flexible. Be flexible to get a win-win outcome. Also, this depends on who the negotiator is. Be flexible. So if it is really, it cannot break the bond, if it doesn't break the implementation of the project in any way, yes, agree to disagree, and so that you can go forth. You don't lose the grant, or you're not put in the black book of those people who are very hard to work with. You know, IPs these days have sub-awardees that they cannot work with because of this information. They keep this list somewhere. Of course, it's not public knowledge, but they know I cannot work with this person. This is the experience we went through. And it does not stop there, by the way. It goes into other implementing partners. And be patient as the sponsor gets more information into the subject matter. And don't be patient forever, because this might be affecting the timelines of the grant. So don't rush into conclusions. At that time is of essence. Keep the communication open. Pick your phones, answer the calls, because this is now at stake. You need the grant, you need to start. Yes, you could be the same person and you're handling several other grants. You need a team to focus on this, and the human resource team has to probably work out this very well so that you don't lose the grant and you don't affect the already running projects. Okay. So those are the key factors that we employ at negotiating a grant. We said, yes, these are normal basic things that we always deal with in our normal lives, but they are pertinent to winning a contract, to negotiating terms and conditions of the contract. Because when everything is set and you have clarified everything, you have gotten what we asked for, negotiations have happened, and what else is left is, yes, we are signing the agreement, this is the start date, and yes, we'll be able to continue. So we wanted to look at sub-grantee contracting, but before we look at the details of sub-grantee contracting, sub-grantee is just another extension of grantee. Sub comes from, is just a subset of grantee, an extension of a grantee. So a grantee is the major recipient of a grant. And the grantee has several responsibilities. So as we look at a sub-grantee, we need to be much more aware of who the grantee is and the responsibilities of a grantee. Then that gives us a better picture of having knowledge into the sub-grantee and knowing their roles, the sub-grantee roles. So the sub-grantee is the major person who receives the grant from the sponsor. It is actually this organization that applied, that submitted the grant in ERA Commons. So, and when at the point of submission, the grantee mentioned the organizations or the people that the grantee will be working with to accomplish the objectives and the aims of the project. So these other people are the sub-grantee. So the responsibilities of our grantee, this is the prime major recipient of the grant, is accountability and responsibility of the use of funds by all parties, thus performance of the grant supported project and activity. So, and the grantee has the responsibility of fulfilling all the obligations as they are reflected in the grant policy statement. And the legal entity, the grantee is the sole direct legal entity, also called the awardee or major recipient or prime recipient. So we continue to see the responsibilities of a grantee. And these responsibilities are going to give us a picture of what the sub-grantee is. So a grantee is also responsible for all the programmatic and financial reporting requirements to NIH. Much as the sub-grantee could be taking a lion's share of the funding, there is a grant that we were running. It was actually a cooperative agreement, and the organization, which was the sub-grantee, was taking 90% of the funds. The 10% was allocated to the prime. So much as the sub-grantee was taking the lion's share, the sole responsibility of reporting to the sponsor is for the grantee. So in this case, the grantee has to closely monitor the activities of the sub-grantee. So, and the grantee is responsible for the timely and appropriate disbursement of funds to the sub-grantees by either using fixed price invoicing method that we saw or cost reimbursable. And normally, as we're going to see, the choice of these approaches is based on the risk assessment of this sub-recipient. if the subrecipient is very good at science, but the administrative and management policies are lacking, there is a big risk of fraud and mismanagement of funds. And in that case, you would not risk to give huge funds to the sub-grantee without accounting for the prior advanced funds. So that drives the grantee to issue a cost reimbursable kind of agreement, as we will see in the subsequent projections. Okay, so the grantee is responsible for the timely. You need to disperse money in time, otherwise this will have an effect on the implementation of the activities, and then appropriate disbursement of funds, as we will see. So in order to do this, the grantee must have written sub-grantee agreement with each consortium, though you may have a template, a standard template for the agreement. You must have each consortium or each sub-grantee with each standalone agreement, because the scope is different. In the sub-award agreement, as we are going to see, we need to look at the detailed scope. What do you expect the sub-grantee to achieve, and what are the roles of the grantee? So the grantee must perform a substantive role in the conduct of the planned research or program, and should not be seen as a conduit for funds transmission. Don't sit in your office and just transmit money because that sub-grantee has submitted a request for funding. Some of them just say, we request a quarterly funding for this, and as a grantee, just disperse money. So don't just sit and just be a conduit for transferring money as a pass-through and not knowing what happens actually with the sub-grantee. And we also need to know that NIH does not allow third-tier sub-grantees. This is what it means. The grantee or the prime gets another person to work on the scope, that is B, and then B also gets another C down below the tray. NIH does not allow third-tier sub-grantees. Okay. And another role is a grantee must ensure that all required assurances are obtained. We shall see a list of the different assurances that the sub-grantee must comply to. So we're going to look at a very detailed sub-award agreement, a sample, a copy that will make us appreciate some of these things. Assurances for like human subjects. Does the sub-grantee have FWAs, the federal wide assurances? Do they have IRB approvals? And this can be found under 45 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, 45, under Chapter 46. And the grantee must ensure all human subject education documentation requirements are met. I think that was covered in the previous trainings. Okay. I will continue with this, and the grantee must obtain prior approval. So if there is any need to change the PI, if there is any need to change the strategies, which definitely change the scope of the implementation, the grantee must apply for a prior approval from NIH. Another role for the grantee, we must ensure that these sub-recipients adhere to the audit requirements as spelled out in the uniform guidance. You'll see the details under CFR 45, Part 75. And briefly, if an entity expends $750,000 in USG funds in a single year, that qualifies this sub-recipient to get an A133 audit. And this audit firm must be a qualified audit firm from the Big Four, Big Five. And the audit finding must be filed with the clearinghouse 9 months after the audit. So we have seen the roles. We have seen the roles of the sub-grantee. So we want to see what, we have seen the roles of the grantee, who is the main, who is the prime that gets this funding from the sponsor or from NIH. Then who is the sub-grantee? A sub-grantee is a collaborative arrangement between the main grantee and one or more organizations where a portion of the programmatic or scientific activity of the project is carried out. It is basically sharing the scope of the project with another person. But the grantee remains with the overall responsibility because NIH doesn't know the sub-grantee. NIH knows the main grantee, the person or the entity that applied for the grant in ERA Commons. Okay, so these are the roles of the sub-grantee. So the sub-grantee PI has the role of providing scientific input which affects the direction of the project. As I told you, some of the sub-grantees, most of the work that is done under the project is actually from the sub-grantee side. So the sub-grantee research provides intellectual contribution to the project aims and objectives, and it covers both scientific and administrative work. They don't report to NIH, and they should be used after prior approval from NIH. Don't wait into the second year of the grant and say, I think we need to put this, I've had entity X it does well in cardiologist activities. I think let's just sub-grant them. We need to get prior approval. So we are under sub-granting now. So more definitions. So we need to distinguish between a sub-grantee and a vendor. I would call a vendor as fee-for-service contractor or vendor. So the fee-for-service contract are used to provide a routine service or goods to the sub-grantee or grantees, such as equipment, fabrication, repairs, data processing, routine analytical testing services, management services, audits. So these are just suppliers in normal English. We call them suppliers. They should not be confused with sub-recipients or sub-grantees, because the rules governing sub-recipients are very different from the rules governing the fee-for-service or contractors. And these services are not programmatic. You don't need prior approval to get let's just go to the next slide to see the differences tabulated, the major differences tabulated. So under a contractor, who I call a supplier or fee-for-service, no involvement in the scope of work. The prime or the major grantee does not involve themselves in the scope of work. Of course, they are both independent entities, but you wouldn't know the work plans, you don't know the details of what happens at the contractor's side. But the sub-grantee or recipient, you need to be substantively involved in what happens. And there are also different modes of how you put the sub-grantee or contractor on board. So as you have seen, NIH does not require prior approval in most, apart from the contractuals, the major contractual categories. You don't need a prior approval to put them on board. what happens, you do due diligence in the procurement regulations, how you put your vendors, do you have pre-qualification exercises before you put them on board? Did you do bidding? Do you have 3 quotes? That is all about the supplier. Here, as you're submitting your grant to NIH, you require prior approval. You need to put their budgets in R&R format. You need to submit their budget justification and all that. And the prime incorporates VAT, withholding tax. Withholding tax is actually different from VAT. So, and on sub-grantee, you should actually you don't have to pay withholding tax. Recently, I was involved in a negotiation which involved this scenario. So we had received where the sub-grantees on this agreement. So this was a very detailed agreement. Their agreement is actually detailed. And below the line, there was an area of our organization having to incorporate withholding tax, so that if our budget was $500,000, we were going to get less by 6% withholding tax, whatever the rate is now. So that was put in small letters. So that calls for the importance of you studying the grant documentation before you actually sign. It took us some time to read through all this award and then having it signed. It took us some time, and that is how we were able to catch this, to nip it really in the bud. So what happened is we're saying if you withhold 6% and you have budgeted the work plan, costed the work plan from zero budgeting, there is no way we are going to be able to implement. So that is how the negotiation comes in now. We said, I think we need to, we don't need to be the vendor, because the language at first was like, it is a sub-grantee arrangement. But later on, when you read the details, we are being referred to as vendors or fee for service. That is how the withholding tax came by. So we said we better change the agreement, otherwise we cannot deliver. So we won that, and the agreement was changed into a sub-grantee arrangement, not a contractor, no vendor, no supply agreement. So, okay, we may not have a lot of time, so I want to rush through this. So the sub-granting process.
Rebecca, before you proceed, there is a question related to the slide on grantees.
Okay.
And it says, from personal experience, cost reimbursement works best where a sub-grantee is a large, well-established institution with substantial financial muscle to incur costs and seek refunds later, but this is not always the case on ground. Where does this leave small organizations with potential to implement activities but do not have the financial resources at hand?
Cost reimbursable, yes, would be the best. You know how cost reimbursable works is you first spend the money and then invoice. And the person you're invoicing, this is what you submit. You submit a summary report, which is like budget versus expenditure, and then show the percentage spent, and you submit a ledger that supports each transaction that you have listed in the summary, in the reporting lines. So what happens is when they verify, they have to verify each transaction. They say, please send us the supporting document for the supplies that you bought. If yes, and I agree, if the organization has very well streamlined accounting policies, it has very well accounting systems, that would be good. The challenge still remains if the sponsor or the prime says, I'm not going to reimburse you for this specific area, or there was an error, there was something, and they failed to reimburse that area, what happens? The subrecipient which received this, which spent this money, has to allocate the expenditure to another grant or lose that expenditure. So that happens under desk review. So yes, it's a very good practice where the subrecipient is fully established. And as I said, it has probably foundational funds which are not really strict, so that you can spend and then submit the expenditure later. That would be the best. However, it remains a challenge for a struggling organization, which could have good science, a struggling organization, financially struggling, not that it doesn't have the systems, you cannot implement. And this is what you have to put at the negotiation table and have that addressed and modified. If the sponsor is willing to work with you because of your systems, because they definitely work with good systems, and you're able to convince the sponsor that, yes, I'm able to deliver, but I'm incapacitated, because also you are not supposed to commingle funds. Show the sponsor, where are you getting the front loading from? You don't have the foundational funds. You don't have other program income, and that is very common with institutions that don't have other non-grant income, but they may have very good science. So my response to that is, please go to the negotiation table with knowledge, with experience. This doesn't even need flexibility, because you cannot deliver, you can't give what you don't have. You need funds to run the science, you need funds to run programs. If you don't have the funds, then you can't do it, you can't deliver. And I'm sure if the sponsor or the donor has the interests and they have really appreciated your previous work, I'm telling you, they'll have to change you. And I'm talking from experience. We had some challenge with Gates Foundation, and we didn't have money to front load some of the activities, and they had to change the agreement, the arrangement to milestone. And I should also add that it works best for the prime or the sponsor for cost reimbursable, because the moment you submit your expenditure invoice and the ledgers and the summary reports and everything is tying in well, they send the money, they wire the money, and they don't have to do any other verification of your expenses. It is actual expenditure. However, on the other side, if it is milestone based, where they just advance the 20%, and then you send accountability for the advance that you received, sometimes the costs that you have spent are not allowable, are questioned, are not eligible. So that provides a challenge to the sponsor. They're going to waste a lot of time asking you to rectify the errors, to correct this and that takes time. And they're not going to give you the money before you rectify this additional funding. However, the onus is on the subrecipient to timely submit the correct expenditure reports so that they also get reimbursed. So I hope I've responded to your question.
Yes, Rebecca, thank you. That is satisfactory.
All right, okay, thank you. So sub-granting process. So we have reached our we have resolved all that, and we have selected our sub-grantees. So there is also a selection process. Some organizations have, if they are going to deal with so many sub-grantees, there is somewhere we are working with 80 sub-grantees, because this was covering a wider scope. There are so many programs, little programs into this project, and we had to do an application, a call for application in the newspaper. So that was a long process. So what I'm going to just briefly describe here is you have already identified the sub-grantee you're going to work with. You're not going to go into the papers to advertise. So the process that I'm going to take here is not for the bigger 80 sub-grantees, but for already identified this specific sub-grantee that you're going to work with, because of their experience, have seen their science, the PI is based in there, and yes, this is the organization to work with. So after selecting the sub-grantee, you already submitted the proposal and their budgets, and you're getting this grant, probably because of the sub-grantee. So what next? This is the process. So share the draft sub-grantee agreement with terms and conditions. We'll look at the copy. There are several conditions with this sub-grantee, and solicit for a walkthrough with the sub-grantees. And this walkthrough will help you. So you're not sharing this major notice of award that you have received from NIH. No, you have already your template. You have modified and updated your template, and you're going to provide a walkthrough so that the sub-grantee also appreciates, accepts. If there are areas to negotiate, then they'll negotiate the areas before they actually sign. So walk through this agreement bit by bit so that they know what they are really going into. They won't be taken by surprises. They won't say, we never saw this, and have that meeting minuted or recorded. So when everything has been done, do the execution, have clarified the questions that they've had about IRBs, about inventions, and all that has been done. Then there is sub-award execution and the start of implementation. What do you do also? You need to have SOPs for monitoring the sub-recipients. These SOPs must be followed through keenly. What do we do at this quarter? What does the program do? So there are several actions as we go along. If there are things that are not going on well, don't fear to terminate the contract and inform NIH. Send warnings, communicate, appraise, and do your internal checks. When you do your internal checks, continue assessing the actioning of the internal checks until you close out. So we're just going to quickly look at this process. I will skip some of the slides because I see I may not have a lot of time. I have mentioned some of the things. So resolve the performance issues with the sub-awardees. Some of the planned strategies could be out of scope. So check for the new NIH regulations. For example, there is a new regulation and of 2 CFR, as I have reflected it there. There is a covered telecommunications debarment. So if there is a budget to procure or obtain any covered telecommunication equipment, system, or service from Huawei, or whatever they pronounce it, like Huawei Technologies or ZTE, that has been discontinued by NIH. So for purposes of this requirement, I read, at the time of application, and as a term and condition of the award, covered telecommunications equipment or services means any of the following: telecommunications equipment produced by Huawei Technologies Company and ZTE Corporation, or any subsidiary or affiliate of such entities. So this has been majorly it has been majorly prohibited. So if there is any budget, take keen interest to look out for things that have been debarred that have been prohibited by NIH, such as this, so that it doesn't come at the point of audit. And if you receive it in the process of implementation, please send an amendment of the contract. Send this communication to them. We also received it, like, I think in February or Jan. I'm sure most of you must have received it. So do risk assessment. Do risk assessment for all the sub-grantees. So even if it is only one or two, even if the organization has been standing there, that is how the Enrons fail, those mighty companies. So do some risk assessment, even if you have already identified this good company you're working with. Have your SOPs to cover institutional registration. Is this organization actually up to date with the NGO filings? Is it a partnership? Is it a company limited by shares, by guarantee? Have an SOP to do that checklist. Look in your checklist, look at the human resources. Salary reflected in is the salary reflected in the contracts the same as in the payroll? Are there timesheets to support salaries? Are the fringe benefits supported by the institutional policies? Are the policies signed? Are they within the NIH cap, or the PI is getting beyond the NIH cap? Look at their procurement guidelines. Are there the policies anyway? Are the policies updated? Are they in line with the USG procurement policies? So adhere to the policy guidelines, because you could have the policies, yes, and they are well established, but even the staff do not know about the human resource policies. Do the policies get updated? How do you communicate this update to the staff? Are there minutes? Do the staff sign somewhere? Was there an assembly called to communicate information, any updated information, and do they sign anywhere for commitment? Okay, look at finance. So these SOPs should cover finance. Do the finance team have the right qualification to deliver? Is there segregation of duties, or the person who is doing cashiering is the same person who is doing data entry and then doing bank reconciliations and then posting and producing reports because you're saving money? So the internal controls have to be well looked into. Do we have internal budgeting? What is the process like? Are there questioned or unsupported expenditure? Do they adhere to the reporting timelines? Do they do reconciliations of cash and bank? Look at the cash count certificate. Are they signed? How often do they do them? It's supposed to be on a monthly basis. So is there a tracker? Do they have a report on unliquidated obligations for the previous years, or they have been forgotten, and when you look at this current year's expenditure report, they are reflected as expenses? How are they treated? Were they lined out? So some of the sub-recipients could be very good at the science, as I said, but when you dig deep in the finance management, it is a terrible space. So is there an accounting software? Poor asset management and lack of asset registers. Some of them don't even have asset registers. There is no compliance for statutory obligations, or late reporting and filing of returns. This has to be detailed, because if you ignore that, it's going to affect the project when the audit comes. Look at the travel policy. Look at the per diems that are paid. Are they supported by the institutional policy? Are there mileage payments? And if it is out of country, are the rates that are paid in per diem, are they supported by the federal rates, or the institution has its own rates. So there's been so many talks about travel that is given, the per diems that are given to the travelers out of state, whether they should follow NIH guidance or institutional policies. But in all my experiences, I think for the audits that we've done, it has always been, we need to follow the NIH, the USG policies. So implementing activities, this can be an issue. There are so many issues around venue hire and vehicle hire. Participants, there's a lot of fraud that can happen in here. And do we have activity reports attached on each payment? It could be tedious and you think you cannot have a summary report. When you get an audit and this is an issue and you refuse to attach the performance report, the sponsor is going to look at the audit report, not what, it's going to be your word against the auditor. You may have to refund the money under questioned costs. So look at the supplies needed for the trainings, the work plans, the performance reports. So the checklist is going to have all these details. Look at the previous audits. Are the prior audit issues solved or they go on rolling year after year? There are post-award actions that the grantee has to take action on. Post-award actions like redirection, reallocation of funds, carryovers, finance meetings to discuss overruns, and approve post-award actions. So motor pool management, are there mileage logbooks, maintenance of logs, fuel cards? That is very, very important. And you need to have a risk assessment register for each sub-grantee. And when you get the risk, if you do the risk assessment, have a summary for each sub-grantee. I've just put a summary of one of the BNC one that we did. So after looking at their human resources, what action do you do? Avoid control transfer. This could be details, but in summary, these were the interventions. Under human resource, there are no timesheets. So we needed to train them into timesheets. And there are issues about recruitment. There are issues about HR policy formulation. I think the policy was still in draft. It was never really signed. And contracts and JDs were well, at least contracts and JDs were well aligned with structure. When you looked at the procurement policies, and we had to review the policies and modify them accordingly. You cannot do this yourself, but you support, you do capacity building. So when you do a risk assessment, you identify gaps, and you also put the intervention here, what you need to do. And it's not a one-time thing you're going to do. If the subrecipient is in red, meaning you need to do support supervision more frequently than you can do for other better performing subrecipients. So we needed to align policies to support them with the SOPs, support acquisition of an accounting software, because they were doing their expenditure in such and it's almost Excel system. And there were issues about payments. So issues about payments, the intervention was, please use mobile money platforms, because there was a lot of forgery. You cross, you put another name. So this all happens when you do support supervision and assessment before you actually sign the contract. You have already identified the subcontract person, but you need to do due diligence. We had to request them to introduce fuel cards to curb the travel issues, the fuel issues, and also requested them to introduce fixed contracts with hotels, and the per diem rates should be fixed in the institutional policies. and we requested them to also do comprehensive insurance because there was a lot of breakages in the car, the repairs, and so many things were happening in there. So I wanted us to just look at the sample of a risk monitor and the tracker for this one that I was just talking about. Maybe we shall look at it later. Let me first finish this. So sub-granting continued. When the agreement is fully executed, this is how we're going to post-award management. We are now managing a sub-award. So we must establish, the first thing is to establish an agreement, and the agreement spells out the terms of service for the science, for the admin, financial, compliance, and all the reporting is covered in the agreement. The grantee must have a substantive role in the project. So NIH, as we said, holds the main grantee accountable. Okay, we shall look at that. So these are the major components of a sub-award agreement. So instead of looking at this, I wanted us to go through to look at the sub-award exactly, but you can quickly go through this. There is a PI, procedure for directing research, procedure for how do they get the funds, the terms, the different terms, for example, financial conflict of interest, provision of data ownership, administrative requirements for NIH, and so forth. So I will quickly stop sharing this, and I want to share, I request to share a copy of a sub-award agreement. So what we were going through, we can quickly get from this sample. So the prime grantee here, it was GEAS, and the sub-recipient was TAME. So the major components of a sub-award agreement, we said it spells out the scope, the expectations on both sides. So this is really a detailed one, and I shall just pick out the salient areas in a sub-award agreement as we go along. So as the grantee, the main grantee, please insert the sub-recipient agreement number, okay? And show that this is the sub-recipient between GEAS and STEM. STEM is the sub-recipient and GEAS is the prime recipient. So we have the federal award identification number. It is also noted in here. We go to, you need to show the effective date of the sub-recipient, the agreement date. So you can, and the importance of this is to show when did we start. If you're billing expenses, the expenses should not be out of before January 1st, 2020. All expenses should be after the effective date. We have been, there's a challenge we faced recently. There was a grant that we had to do, and we had to do some preliminary work for us to get this grant. And we were negotiating whether the sub-award agreement could be extended to start December 2019 instead of February 2021. Sorry, December 2020 instead of February 2021. And I'm telling you, we lost that. And the expenses were like $37,000. And we agreed to lose that because we thought this could be, the expenses were mutually understood. So the negotiations hadn't actually kicked in by the time we signed, but we had to agree to lose that $7,000. It was for the good of the project, but wasn't compliantly justifiable. So we had to lose that 37,000. So it's important to show the effective date and the nature of STEM. STEM is the sub-recipient. So it is a company limited by a guarantee, and it was established by blah, blah, blah. And this is where the office is located. So this is just witnessed. So whereas the GIAs received notice of award on this date, the award from US Department of DHHS for subscribed, blah, 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 blah. So there are several attachments that we are going to see. Sometimes it's called appendix or appendices to the sub-award agreement. They are very, very important. They have details. So attachment one is this shows the scope. The attachment one shows the scope of the grant, the activities that are going to be expected to be performed by both parties. So that is attachment one, attachment A, and then they need to be very, very detailed. There is a sample that is attached in here, and I'm telling you it is really, really detailed. So that would be attachment one. It shows all those details. You may not have all the time to really read all that, but I just want to show you. Okay, so it describes the program. Then you need to show the period of the agreement. So the period of the agreement, they state both the project period. The project period could be maybe 5 years, but then we need to know that the activities, we need to mention the budget period, because it helps when we are looking at the budget for that period and the expenditures for that period and the funding that was provided for that period. These are mentioned in the category of funding. So I'll go to the obligation. So the GIAs hereby obligates this amount of money for disbursement to the subrecipient during the term. And the term basically means that is the budget period, not the entire project period, because something can happen along the way and you may not be able to go into year 2 or year 3. So if year 2 comes, you modify, you this time modify the agreement to show what is being awarded in year 2. So be still under this with the agreement, we show the financial management. What are you expected to do under financial management? What are the conditions? You need to trace funds of expenditures. These have to be clear. Prepare expenditure reports. These all have to be clear. And then internal controls. You need to really, really be strong on internal controls. And it says the subrecipient must establish and maintain effective internal controls over the agreement. As per 45 CFR 75, definitely if the subrecipient doesn't know this, you need to walk them through and build their capacity to comply with federal statutes and regulations, evaluate and monitor the subrecipient's compliance with the statutes and regulations. And when there is anything out of line, please take immediate action, because you're protecting both your reporting compliance and the subrecipient. So mention there is budget and cost share. This was not really a cost sharing agreement. Cost sharing meaning you're taking 70%, this grant is going to provide 70% and the institution is going to provide 30%. No, this was 100% funded as per funding the objectives of the study. Now, attachment 2 is normally the budget. The budget has to be attached on the sub-award agreement, and it has to be detailed. Also attach the budget justification that has finally been agreed to, so that it will be a point of reference as you do the support supervision and the meetings of finance to reflect the expenditure burn rates and the details. So all revisions to the budget shall be made only as permitted by identified regulations, and it requires prior written approval. And the subrecipient shall report any deviations from the budget or program scope or objective, or request prior written approval from the GIAs for one or more of the following program or budget-related areas if there is a change in scope or the objective of the program. If there is any change in key persons specified, if there is disengagement from the program for more than 3 or more months, or 25% reduction in time devoted. And then the reason they are doing this is because this prime has to request for either a redirection or prior approval if there is any change of scope. If the PI has changed, if the effort has reduced, the prime has to manage and report this to the NIH or to the sponsor. So these are details that will require prior approval. Okay. In applying and accounting for funds, the subrecipient shall adhere to the cost principle contained in 48 CFR 31.2, that is Federal Acquisition Regulations. So the cost principles that we looked at in the prior discussions, the cost principles of reasonableness, allocation, allowability must always be adhered to. And how are you going to do this monitoring? As we said earlier, you're not going to sit in your offices and just disperse money. Do support supervision. Your SOPs must emphasize support supervision. As we're going to see ahead, what things do we look at when we are doing support supervision? So I just look through this. Cost share, we have already discussed cost sharing. And in your meetings in support supervision, you're going to look at budget forecasts. Look at the liquidation. Are you able to do the remaining scope of work with the remaining funds? This is where these decisions come from when you look at your expenditure reports. And as I said before, we would recommend that the financial monitoring meetings happen on a monthly basis. You can say by the 15th of every month following the month of expenditure, we shall have a finance meeting. And this is what we're going to look at the burn rates, requests for redirections, and all that as we're going to see. So look at the forecast. There is also an attachment number 3, looks at forecasts. It's important to do a monthly projection up to the time that you're going to be running. For example, if the study of the project ends every September, do a forecast of how much you have in the budget, how much has been downloaded, and your expenditure forecast up to September, so that you can quickly know whether you need to realign funding, whether you need to do a supplementary request, that is if it's allowed, or you may not be able to use the money so that you can ask for a carryover. So that is in attachment 3. It has a detailed projection month by month. So attachment 4 looks at bank account. So when you have finally signed the sub-award agreement, request for the bank details of the sub-recipient. We're going to look at a copy of a bank detail that will be part of the attachment of this. So one of the conditions that NIH gives is this money must be maintained in an interest-bearing account. So if you have been using USD funds in savings accounts that do not have interest, that can be an issue. We have in one of the projects, we had to reimburse, I think it was around $45,000 to the DHHS into PMS for not, this was a new project, I think, and there was an oversight of requesting the bank to actually put this money in an interest-bearing account. So 6 months down the road, that is when we realized that this account is actually not interest-bearing. So we wrote to the bank, and the bank took some 2-month delay. So a whole 8 months, the account was not bearing interest. When the auditors came to do an audit, they realized that for 8 months, the project had started, but there was no interest on the account. So that was an audit finding. And what happens is the auditors are given the obligation to compute the interest that will have accrued, to that account for the 8 months. And that is what happened. So it was an audit finding, and we were requested to refund into the PMS $45,000. So that was a pain, because you have to get it off other monies. And as I said, if you don't have any other non-grant income projects, you have to, you definitely need, it goes into the directors now to cough it off their pockets. So attachment 3, we said it's forecast, and forecast gives you the liquidation, how much you'll be able to liquidate. Program reports and plans. I told you I'm not going to look at everything, but I'm just picking out salient features in the notice, in the sub-award agreement. It could be a little different from what you normally have, but this is really, really detailed, and it's good. It covers a lot of things. So you need to look at the program reports and the plans. You need to let the subrecipient know, how often do I report? Is there a template for reporting the progress, the status? So there normally needs to be a progress reporting template. So the contents will be agreed upon of the reports, the implementation plan, and there has to be an element of timeliness of submitting. So there should be a monitoring and evaluation plan, and which has all these details, which we're not going to go into. So these are the clauses that we talked about. A clause on property. What do we mean by fixed equipment? So equipment or real property, equipment as described in 45 CFR 75, the donor requirements on reporting on equipment, intellectual property. Subrecipient shall ensure that any intellectual property created by others, including but not limited to its contractors and subrecipients using the funds, is assigned to you, the prime. You must have the ability to make sure that there is a fixed asset register at the subrecipient's systems to monitor the fixed asset that were bought using the project funds. Procurement has to be in line with as we said, and if there is communication, publicity, use of name and logo, that must have to be approved if you're going to use the logo, and branding, and disclaimer for conference meetings, seminars, and materials. So the funding for this conference was made possible. This has to be put in there by NIH, and views expressed in written conference materials or publications and by the speakers moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of DHHS, nor does the mention of trade names, practices, etc. endorsed by the US government. That is a disclaimer that has to be put into these details so that the subrecipient knows. So close out. When we are closing out, the subrecipient has to know what they are expected to do. And this has to be done in time, so that you are not caught by the reporting timelines in the system. And so the audit, we talked about the audit, so I'm not going to dwell much on that. So attachment 6, we need to make sure that our sub-recipients do the federal funding accountability and transparency reporting. If 80% of their income comes from USD funds, so there is a requirement to report. So you need to tell them what they are supposed to do. So these are certifications that we have. They are just these things that you cannot change, okay? That is under number 7. Those are the certifications that you cannot change. For example, it prohibits sexual activities, so which we have. Those are already laid down, and you probably need to look at the remedies for non-compliance so that the sub-recipients know if they don't comply, what happens. So you disallow, I'm just going to quickly look at this. You temporarily withhold cash payments pending correction of the deficiency. Disallow, deny them funds, wholly or partially suspend or terminate the agreement, recommend the initiation of suspense or debarment proceeding by the donor as authorized under 2 CFR 180, withhold further agreements for the program, take other remedies. So by the time you take these remedies, really, you have exhausted all possible avenues to make things right. So all the rest are just the certifications. And for semi-majority, that is always in every sub-award agreement or big agreement. Things for termination, those are basic things that are always there in the agreement. So these other ones are the basics that we always look at. And then finally, we do the signatures. For the prime and the sub-recipient, they all have to certify. So this is the summary of attachment. The scope of work, the budget summary, detailed and budget justification, the forecasting, funding, frequency and reporting, payment instructions, identified regulations, the FATA reporting, certifications, and then notice of information. These are the contacts of people that have to be contacted in case of anything. So there's also an attachment here for the scope of work, as I told you. This is just the scope of work. It's really detailed. There's no way someone says, no, I wasn't aware of this. There is a framework. There's purpose and objectives. This is all under scope. This is all under the scope. So there's an attachment of a budget summary, and a detailed budget, and then forecasting, funding, frequency, and reporting. This is a whole writing of what you're expected to do in the forecast. So the sub-recipient has all the information to deliver. Attachment 4 is the payment instructions. The bank, which bank are you going to use? All these have to be attached to the sub-award agreement. Number 5, we said is identified regulations. And finally, the FATA, detailed, and then the certifications here And finally, we have, in your organization, you say the contacts will be maybe the business official, the PI, the finance manager, blah, blah, blah. So this is it. I'm going to stop to share this quickly. And I'm going to stop to share this quickly. And Claire? Hello, Claire?
Yes,
I was requesting that probably you can run through the admin.
Okay, thank you.
Before I continue.
Maybe we can take some questions if we have anyone that has a question or inquiry to make. Please feel free to raise it.
So as we have already looked at that. So I hope there are no questions. So we can quickly probably look at the more as we complete.
Rebecca, can I go on with the training evaluation exercise?
Yes, so probably you can look at the 2 or more slides, then you can go ahead with the evaluation. So I will quickly look, sorry?
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
So still under sub-award management, you have managed to look at briefly at the sub-award agreement. As I said, it's really detailed, but those are the pertinent things that we should include in a sub-award agreement. So you need to develop the sub-grantee manual or handbook, which has all these details of managing sub-grantees. And after the risk assessment exercise, you must develop the capacity building programs that address the areas of concern. And it's not a one-time thing. Monitor progress through regular support supervision. And for each supervision, please document the progress. Support supervision teams should comprise representation from programs, from grants, from finance, internal auditors, so that the entire grant is covered, and update the supervision tool as need be. You need to develop a tracker for each sub-grantee as we saw. So you need to have these meetings, and in these meetings, please emphasize to have a budget appraisal and a scientific review meeting. They should not be mixed, otherwise the other one gets more attention. Sometimes they get lost into scientific issues and the admin come when the auditors come. So you need to have a special budget appraisal monthly meeting that is a standalone, whether you do it on Zoom or real, and then you arrange for a quarterly hands-on mentorship, that will be fine. So the budget appraisal must include the summary of expenditure versus budgets in all the reporting areas of personnel, fringe, supplies, equipment, and others. You must attach the expenditure listing for all transactions. And you, the people sitting in these budget meetings, please look at those details before the auditors come. That is when you're going to identify the areas that need redirection, that were wrongly posted, the carryover needs, and then identify issues of release restriction. So under closeout, we look at the system. So our sub-recipient need to know what we need to submit during the closeout process. So our final reports are due in ERA Commons 120 days calendar, within 120 calendar days before the end of the grant support. However, you need to get these reports 90 days. Don't give them 120 days, the sub-recipient. Give them 90 days. So the reports that we submit are the final federal financial report, which are submitted electronically, and then the final research performance progress report, which will summarize the achievements and major outcomes at the end of the fifth year. And this report is made public. You need to know about that. What do you want the public to know about the inventions? And then the final invention statement and certifications. So under closeout, the subrecipient must submit no less than 45 calendar days after the program ended all financial, program, and other reports required by the terms and conditions of the agreement. They must liquidate all obligations incurred under the agreement as set forth in attachment 3. They must promptly refund any balances of unobligated cash. Please don't allow so many excuses. They may have so many excuses of unliquidated obligations, and that is not allowable. It might affect your going concern as an institution or the PI that is involved in this particular project. So the subrecipient must account for any property acquired with the funds. If you did not really monitor the asset management register, you're in for a dead end. So under grant closeout, if there is any delay on the sub-grantee side to submit documents, the result could be the following. There is delay in pending awards to the PI. NH may withhold non-competing awards. It may disapprove allowing the affected PI to be named the PI or key personnel on any other grant, or NH may add to an existing award a condition that will preclude initiation of the project until the required documents are accepted. So in case of failure to submit, the organization may be suspended or debarred. So we look at the grants policy statement, and thank you very much. Institution, you're protecting your PI. So because you need your institution to continue being a going concern. So you need to divulge more into the activities of the sub-grantee and communicate before you wait for the auditors to come. Actually, you should be looking at the financials before the auditors come to see, before the other regulators come to see the science. You need to be on top of that game so that you're not taken by surprise. So thank you very much. I don't have to share everything that I think I prepared. This is really going to be a starting point or more learning points that we have picked today. So thank you very much.